I never thought a piece of land could hold so much weight, but looking back now, I realize it was never just dirt and grass. That farm was my life, my family, my history, and every ridge and furrow told a story of generations before me. My grandfather, a man who came from nothing, had poured his sweat, his soul, and every last penny he had into that patch of earth. I grew up running through the fields, chasing the wind in the tall corn, watching the golden sun dip behind the distant hills, feeling like nothing in the world could ever touch us. That farm was my fortress, a place where laughter rang out freely, where every fence post and weathered barn told a story of resilience and hard work. I had always believed that land would be ours forever. I had always thought the farm was untouchable, that family meant loyalty, that the roots that ran deep beneath my feet would keep us safe. I was wrong. It all began with a letter, one of those official-looking envelopes that make your heart sink before you even open them. I found it under my door one morning, the envelope crisp, the paper stiff, and the print too precise to ignore. I remember holding it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, wondering who would dare write something like this to me. The letter claimed that someone had a legal claim on my property, and that if I did not respond promptly, serious action could be taken against me. At first I laughed. I laughed because the idea seemed absurd, almost comical. Who would try to take a farm from a man who had lived there his entire life, who had tended to it through droughts, storms, and hard winters? I read the letter again, and then again, thinking maybe I had missed something, hoping it was some kind of mistake. But each time I read it, the laughter died a little more. My stomach tightened. The knot of worry started in the pit of my gut and spread like cold water through my chest. That evening, I went to the diner, trying to push the letter from my mind, trying to laugh with old friends over coffee and pie, but the whispers started as soon as I stepped in. People I had known my whole life, farmers, shopkeepers, even neighbors, were talking in low tones, glances darting around as if afraid someone might hear them. They spoke of a wealthy developer from the city, a man with deep pockets and deeper connections, who was buying up land all over the county. The words, "if you have land, they want it," and sometimes people just vanish, echoed in the background of the conversation, more like a threat than idle gossip. I tried to shake it off, telling myself stories like that always get blown out of proportion, that small towns love to invent legends, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Then came the phone call. I still remember the sound of it, the way it made my skin crawl even before I answered. The voice on the other end was calm, polite even, but every word dripped with menace. They said my family should consider selling, suggested it would be better for everyone if I cooperated. I could almost hear the smirk hidden behind the words, the kind of smile that only people who believe they are untouchable can wear. It was chilling. The reality hit me like a physical blow. People I had known my entire life, people I had trusted without question, were either blind to the danger or worse, aiding those who wanted to take away everything I had fought to protect. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a flaw in the plan that seemed so meticulously laid out. That night I could not sleep. I lay on my old mattress staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with scenarios, possibilities, and fears. I thought about every storm the farm had survived, every long, hot summer and every freezing winter, and wondered if all that history could somehow protect me now. The wind rattled against the window, the barn creaked in the dark, and I realized that the fight ahead was going to be harder than anything I had faced in my life. This was not just about land. It was about legacy, about pride, about every memory I had ever cherished. And worse, I had no idea how dirty the battle would get, how cunning the people I thought I could trust had become. I lay there, heart pounding, thinking about the family portraits on the wall, about my grandfather's hands, worn and calloused, and I made a silent vow that no matter what, I would not let them take this from me.
The days that followed felt strange, like the world I had known my entire life had suddenly shifted by an inch. Just enough to make everything feel off, but not enough for anyone else to notice. The farm looked the same on the surface. The sun still rose behind the old maple tree. The chickens still clucked at dawn, the horses still pawed at the dirt waiting for their feed. But beneath that familiar routine, something darker had begun creeping in. I could feel it before I could prove it, like a pressure in the air or an instinct that kept tugging at the back of my mind. It started slowly. I would look out the kitchen window while brewing my morning coffee and see figures walking along the property line. Strangers, not the usual hikers or locals. These were people dressed too neatly, walking with purpose, holding clipboards or phones held high like they were recording something. They would stand there staring at the land, measuring it with their eyes, talking quietly to each other before slipping away when they noticed me watching. At first I told myself they were just surveyors passing by or folks who got lost, but the more I saw them, the more obvious it became that they were not lost at all. They knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were looking for. Then the strange vehicle tracks began showing up on the property. Deep tire impressions in places no one had any business driving through. Sometimes I would wait before dawn and see the faint glow of headlights disappearing down the dirt road. Vehicles I did not recognize. Engines running too quietly. Movements too deliberate for something innocent. I would grab my coat and walk out, but they were always gone by the time I got close. My dogs, usually calm old boys who knew the difference between wildlife and people, began reacting strangely too. They would bark at the tree line or growl low when the wind shifted, as if they sensed someone watching even when I could not see a thing. They stayed restless at night, packing instead of sleeping, noses pointing toward the open fields like they smelled a stranger lurking out there in the darkness. The gates were the final sign that convinced me something was happening. I'm a careful man. I've lived long enough to know that a gate left open can lead to disaster. Animals wander off, thieves find easy access, and trouble follows open spaces. So I always locked every gate before sundown. Always. Yet over the next week I found 3 different gates cracked open just enough for someone to slip through. Not wide enough to be obvious, just enough to make me feel uneasy. Not the kind of open a gust of wind could cause. The kind of open left by a human hand. Each time I closed them with a heavier heart, feeling the invisible line between safety and danger thinning a little more. It was subtle, yes, but I had lived in this town my entire life. I knew the difference between coincidence and intention, and every sign pointed toward intention. Whoever was after my land was getting bolder, testing my boundaries, learning my habits. They wanted me rattled. They wanted me to feel watched. And the worst part was I did. I decided to get ahead of whatever game they were playing. I called a friend I trusted from the local council. A man who had shared beers with me on summer nights, who had borrowed tools from my shed, who used to ride horses with me when we were younger. I asked him straight if there had been any legal inquiries about my land. At first he acted confused, then suddenly he became too talkative, rambling about community events and property taxes, carefully avoiding the one thing I was asking about. His voice cracked slightly and he would not meet my eyes even through the phone. That awkward shift told me everything I needed to know. It was not ignorance, it was guilt. Someone had gotten to him. Maybe they offered him money. Maybe they threatened his position. Maybe they promised him something he could not refuse. In a small town, everyone has a price even if they pretend they do not. The realization settled over me like a cold shadow. This was not just about some developer trying to snatch up property. This was deeper. This was internal. This was people I knew, people I trusted, people who had shared meals with me, turning their backs and handing over information to outsiders for their own gain. Neighbors I had helped fix fences, friends I had defended during disagreements, even family. The betrayal reached further than I imagined, twisting through the town like a silent vine, wrapping around everything I once believed was steady. The moment everything snapped into focus was one afternoon when I drove past the old mill. The place had been abandoned for years, but folks still used it as a meeting spot when they wanted privacy. I slowed as I passed, not intentionally spying, just curious why there were cars parked near the rusted loading docks. That is when I saw them. Two men I had never seen before standing with my cousin Tom. Tom had always been good to me. We grew up together, rode bikes down the same dirt roads, sat at the same family table every Thanksgiving. He had always been the one who offered to help with repairs, who checked in on me during storms. But the look on his face that day told me he was no longer the boy I grew up with. He looked uncomfortable, kept shifting his weight, glancing around like he did not want anyone to see him. When he spotted me, he froze, then forced a smile and gave me a wave that felt as unnatural as a plastic plant. His eyes avoided mine, flicking away too quickly. It was the kind of look that says, "I hope you did not hear what we were discussing." In that moment, something inside me broke, a quiet crack. I knew without needing a single explanation that he was involved. Maybe not at the beginning, maybe not willingly, but he was part of it now. Whether he had been bribed, pressured, or misled did not matter. The betrayal had started long before that letter landed on my doorstep, long before the strangers showed up, long before the tire tracks and the open gates. They had laid the groundwork quietly, while I had been living my life unaware that the ground beneath me was shifting. When I got home that evening, I did not sit down or rest. I grabbed an old notebook from my drawer and began writing everything down. Every unfamiliar face, every strange track. 2 weeks passed in a slow, heavy haze. Every day felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the next sign that someone was tightening the noose around my land. I woke early each morning before the sun had even broken over the hills and walked the entire property line just to reassure myself everything was still standing. The fences, the barns, the cattle, the trees that had been there longer than I had been alive. I checked every gate twice. I checked the locks. I checked the fields for new tracks. I tried to convince myself I was being cautious, not paranoid, but deep inside I knew something was coming. You do not feel the air thickening around you for nothing. You do not sense danger every time the wind shifts unless something is truly hunting you. The first real strike hit on a quiet morning, the kind of morning where the sky looked washed out and the air felt heavy with the promise of trouble. I heard the rumble of a truck before I even saw it. At first I thought it was a delivery truck passing through, nothing unusual, but the sound did not fade. It grew louder, slow, intentional, as if whoever was driving wanted me to hear it. I stepped onto the porch and watched a large contractor truck pull up near the old oak line. The trees my grandfather had planted before I was even born. Trees older than most memories I carried. I felt a sting in my chest as soon as I saw the man jump out of the truck with a saw slung over his shoulder like he owned the place. I walked over calmly, though my heart was pounding like someone was knocking inside my ribs. I asked the man who he was and what he thought he was doing on my land. He was a tall man with a trimmed beard and the kind of boots you buy when you expect to walk all over someone. He barely met my eyes before pulling out a set of folded papers. He said he had a permit to cut the trees down. His tone was casual but almost mocking, like he expected me to be impressed. He told me the trees were marked for removal and that there was nothing I could do about it. I asked to see the papers. He hesitated for just a moment but handed them over. I opened them slowly, scanning every line. On the surface they looked official, the kind of print and seals that can trick a lot of folks in a small town. But I had lived long enough and faced enough schemes to spot mistakes. The dates were wrong. The signature was wrong. The wording was sloppy. The type of language agencies use was off just enough to make the whole thing smell rotten. It was a fake permit. Not even a good one. Something someone slapped together quickly, thinking no one would bother to question it. I looked up at him and told him the permit was not valid. His eyes shifted. He smiled nervously. Then he said he did not know anything about that and that he had already been paid. Paid in advance, he said, as if that excused the fact that he was trespassing and trying to destroy trees that had stood longer than any of us. When I told him again that he was not cutting down a single branch, his whole attitude changed. His smile dropped. His jaw tightened. He stepped closer like he thought he could use his size to scare me into backing down. I am over 50 years old, but I have spent my entire life working on a farm. I have hauled fence posts heavier than him. I have pulled machines out of mud deeper than his boots. I have weathered storms fiercer than the anger he was trying to throw at me. So I did not move. I did not flinch. I stood my ground and told him plainly that he needed to turn around and leave. He stared at me for a moment, trying to figure out if he could push further, then finally realized he was not going to win that standoff. He muttered under his breath something about me making a mistake and stomped back to his truck. The engine roared to life and he drove off, leaving a trail of dust behind him. But the real damage had already been done. It was not about the trees. It was about sending a message. They wanted me rattled. They wanted me scared. They wanted me to know they could walk onto my property and try to tear apart my history whenever they pleased. That evening I drove into town to talk to the sheriff. I wanted everything documented. I wanted proof recorded. I wanted someone in law enforcement to acknowledge that what was happening was not normal. But when I got to the sheriff's office, they told me he was unavailable. Out on some call, they said. I explained the situation to the deputy on duty. He listened with a look that told me he was more annoyed than concerned. When I showed him the fake permit, he barely glanced at it. He said it was hard to prove anything without a direct threat and suggested I hire a lawyer. His tone made it clear he was brushing me off. I could not tell if he was scared to get involved or if someone had already whispered in his ear. Either way, the result was the same. No support, no backup, no protection from the law. Walking out of that office felt like walking into a cold, empty room where every wall had been stripped bare. It hit me right then that I was alone. Not just alone physically, alone in every way that mattered. No law to protect me, no neighbors willing to stand beside me, no family I could trust completely. The weight of that truth set.
The shift was slow at first, almost invisible, like the way shadows move across the ground when the sun sets. You don't notice the darkness crawling in until it's wrapped around your feet. I began my search for answers quietly, trying not to let anyone know I was already suspicious. I felt like a stranger in a town I'd lived in my whole life, forced to look at familiar faces through a different lens. Each handshake felt heavier, each greeting a little too forced, and every smile from people I had once trusted seemed to carry some hidden meaning. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that stress was distorting the truth, but the more questions I asked, the more lies I uncovered, and the more the ugly reality began to take shape. It started with a simple conversation at the feed store. Old Mr. Harris, a man who had known my family since before I could walk, mentioned casually that some folks had been discussing my land as though it was already on the market. The way he said it, softly, cautiously, made my stomach twist. He wasn't trying to gossip. He was warning me. His eyes darted toward the cashier like he was afraid someone would overhear. That was my first sign that betrayal was already spreading through the town like wildfire, whispered behind closed doors, and traded like currency between people who used to call me friend. After that, I paid closer attention. I noticed who avoided my eyes when I walked past. I noticed the sudden hush of conversations when I stepped into the diner. And worst of all, I noticed Tom, my cousin, my childhood partner in every adventure and mischief, standing too close to men who didn't belong here, men with polished shoes and expensive jackets who looked at the land like it was nothing more than a business opportunity. The day I saw him handing them rolled-up papers, maps of the farm I later confirmed, something inside me cracked. When he saw me, he smiled like everything was normal, but his smile didn't reach his eyes, and for the first time in my life, his face looked like a mask. That night, I sat on the porch long after the sun had disappeared, replaying every moment with Tom, every favor I had done for him, every time he had cried on my shoulder when life hit him hard. I remembered the way our grandfather had placed his hands on our shoulders when we were boys and told us the land would belong to us both someday, as long as we cared for it and cared for each other. And now here he was, helping strangers carve it up for their own profit. The betrayal stung so deeply it felt physical, like something sharp twisting beneath my ribs. But it wasn't just Tom. The more I watched, the more I realized the web was wider than I ever imagined. The Millers, who had borrowed tools from me more times than I could count, were passing along details about when I left the farm. Eddie, a man who had eaten at my table nearly every Sunday for years, was suddenly visiting the courthouse a little too often, slipping in and out like a thief. Even Mrs. Dawson, who had once treated me like her own son, had been overheard telling someone that maybe the farm was better off in more capable hands. Every discovery felt like another door closing, another crack spreading through the foundation of trust I had built over half a century. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the reasons behind it. Some did it for money, a few $100s here, a promise of a future job there. Others did it out of fear, pressured by threats from the same people trying to take my land. And some, the most disappointing of all, did it out of envy, quiet resentment they had harbored for years because the land had been passed down to me and not to them. I had never realized how heavy other people's jealousy could be, until I felt it crushing my own chest. Late one night, as I sat alone with stacks of old land documents spread across my dining table, it struck me that this wasn't just a legal battle or a territorial dispute. It was a test of loyalty, a revelation of who these people truly were beneath their polite greetings and friendly waves. Betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in through the cracks when no one is watching. It grows quietly in dark corners, and when it finally reveals itself, it does so with a blade pressed to your back. But as painful as it was, the clarity it brought was sharper than any knife. I understood now that I couldn't fight this battle with blind trust or wounded pride. My grandfather had always told me that the land teaches you two things, hard work and patience. And in that moment, I realized that revenge, real revenge, wasn't about roaring back in anger. It was about knowing exactly when to stay silent, when to gather evidence, when to let people think they had the upper hand, and when to strike so precisely and unexpectedly that the entire game collapses beneath them. So I took a breath, steadied myself, and began to plan. I no longer looked at betrayal as a heartbreak. I looked at it as a map. Every traitor was a marker. Every lie was a trail. Every handshake that lingered too long, every whisper that stopped when I entered a room, every guilty glance, it was all information. They thought they were outsmarting me, cornering me, weakening me. But they were only revealing their weaknesses, their desperation, and their greed. And if there's one thing I learned growing up on that farm, it's that you don't fight a storm with panic and shouting. You plant your feet firmly, wait for the right moment, and then use the force of the wind to turn everything back on the ones who tried to destroy you. And so, with betrayal burning like fire in my chest and strategy cooling my mind like water, I decided that this wouldn't just be a fight to protect my land. This would be a reckoning, a lesson, a turning point. The moment they would realize that the man they thought was easy to deceive was far more patient, far more resilient, and far more dangerous than they ever imagined.
The shift from fear to strategy happened so quietly inside me that I hardly noticed it. One morning, as the sun rose over the fields, casting long shadows across the patches of earth my grandfather once plowed with his own hands, I realized the panic had settled. What replaced it was something colder, steadier, sharper. It wasn't anger anymore, it was calculation. If they wanted a war, they would get one, but it was going to be on my terms. I wouldn't rush. I wouldn't lash out blindly. I would build my revenge the same way my grandfather had built this farm, slowly, methodically, with a stubborn patience that could outlast storms and droughts alike. I knew from the moment the first contractor stepped onto my property with forged documents that this fight wasn't going to be won by fists or threats. These people had money, connections, influence, but what they lacked was integrity, and that was the one thing I had in abundance. So I began documenting everything, down to the smallest detail. Every time a strange vehicle drove past too slowly, I wrote down the time, the make, the model. Every time a phone call came in from an unknown number with a voice too calm to be innocent, I recorded it. I started treating my own land like a battleground, noting every footprint, every snapped twig, every sign that someone had trespassed while I slept. There were nights I stayed awake in the living room, lights off, listening to the quiet hum of the cameras I had installed around the property. I had never imagined I would need surveillance on the farm that had always been as safe to me as a cradle, but necessity has a way of reshaping a man's world. The cameras were hidden well, tucked beneath tree branches, inside old birdhouses, even strapped under the porch railings. The footage they captured was more than proof. It was a window into the desperation of my enemies. Strangers walking my boundary lines with flashlights at 3 in the morning. Cars parking just out of sight, engines running as if someone was waiting for a signal. Paperwork being exchanged between men who thought they were invisible in the dark. Every second of it was stored meticulously on drives I hid in places no one would think to search, including inside a hollow fence, post my grandfather had built himself. But I knew cameras alone wouldn't be enough. If I went to the local sheriff, they'd laugh it off or worse. They'd warn the very people I was trying to expose. I needed someone who couldn't be bought, someone who couldn't be intimidated into silence. That's when I remembered the retired attorney in the next town over. A man known for 2 things: winning cases no one else could touch and refusing bribes even when he desperately needed the money. His name carried weight in courtrooms across the state, and though he had stepped away from the fight years ago, I knew he still had fire in him. So one day I drove down to see him, carrying with me a small stack of printed photos, timestamps, and suspicious documents. The moment he looked through the evidence, his expression changed. There was something like fury in his eyes, but it wasn't emotional, it was professional. The kind of fury a man feels when he sees the law twisted, when justice is tampered with. He told me to sit down, poured us both a cup of black coffee, and said he would help me. Not for money, not for favors, but because he hated seeing people bullied by corruption. For the first time in weeks, a spark of hope flickered inside me. I wasn't alone anymore. I had someone who knew how to turn scattered clues into a case, someone who understood the legal traps the developers were trying to set. But simply gathering evidence wasn't enough. I knew my enemies were growing bold. Their arrogance was becoming visible. They believed the town was already theirs, that my farm was just another piece of land ready to be devoured. They were moving fast, thinking I was cornered. But they didn't understand that the more pressure they applied, the more mistakes they made. Greed is loud, sloppy, impatient. I could see it clearly in their behavior, and so I decided to use it against them. I began laying traps, not physical ones but psychological ones. I created fake documents, carefully aged and stamped, hinting at imaginary plans to sell off the northern pasture. I left them where I knew the wrong people would find them. I spoke loudly on fake phone calls about potential buyers from out of state, knowing the walls in small diners tend to have ears. I let word spread that I was considering subdividing the property. I even left a forged map, my own forgery, ironically enough, showing projected sale prices far below market value, knowing greed would cloud their judgment faster than any truth ever could. And it worked. Within days, the group targeting me became restless. They stopped coordinating smoothly. Arguments broke out among them about who should approach me, who would profit, who deserved first rights. I watched it all unfold from the shadows like a spectator at a play I had written myself. Their confidence began to fracture. Their secrecy slipped. They started contacting people they once avoided, desperate to confirm whether I truly intended to sell. Every move they made, every lie they told, every betrayal they committed, they were exposing themselves without realizing it, laying down evidence at my feet piece by piece. Tom, my cousin, was the easiest to manipulate without him ever catching on. He was greedy but not intelligent enough to question the sudden shift in my demeanor. When he overheard me talking about selling a small portion of the land, his eyes lit up like a child offered candy. He immediately ran to the very people who had been using him, eager to deliver the news in exchange for their approval. He didn't realize that I was listening too, recording the whole exchange through a device hidden in the old barn he thought was empty. Every lie he told, every detail. The morning of the meeting felt heavy in a way I could not describe with simple words. The sky was gray and still. The air held the weight of something about to break. I stood on my porch looking over the fields that shaped my life for more than 50 years, and I felt a quiet strength settle in my chest. This was the day everything would turn. This was the day masks would fall and truth would stand on its own feet. I had spent months gathering proof. I had spent nights awake watching shadows move where they did not belong. I had listened to lies wrapped in soft voices, and now it was time to bring every hidden thing into the light. I invited Tom and 3 others to the farm, men who had stepped into my home in the past and eaten meals at my table, men who had once laughed with me like family. Now they walked up my driveway with greedy eyes that had grown too used to the scent of easy profit. They believed I was ready to surrender. They believed the land I had fought to protect was finally slipping from my hands. I watched them approach with their false confidence. Their steps were quick. Their smiles were wide. But underneath their bravado, I sensed a nervous rush in the way they glanced at one another. I led them into the old barn. The place still carried the smell of old hay and warm dust. Sunlight pushed through the gaps in the boards and formed long strips of gold across the floor. It felt right to confront them there. The barn was the heart of our farm for generations. My grandfather had built every beam with his own hands. My father had repaired it through storms and long winters. I had grown up beside that barn learning lessons only a life on the land could teach. Bringing them inside that space felt like bringing them before the spirit of every person who had worked and bled to keep our family legacy alive. They sat at a long wooden table thinking we were about to discuss terms. They still thought I was the same man who received that first letter with fear in his hands. They thought they had worn me down with their pressure and their threats. I pulled out the folder I had prepared. It was thick and heavy. Inside it lay the truth they had been avoiding. The truth they believed I was too old to discover. The truth they never expected would be used against them. I opened the folder and placed a stack of printed photos on the table. At first none of them moved. They simply stared with confused expressions waiting for me to explain. Then slowly, their faces began to change. The first photo showed a stranger surveying my property at night. The next photo showed Tom handing over a map of my land. Another showed 2 men exchanging money behind the mill. I placed everything one by one, letting the silence press on them like a stone. The more they saw, the more their confidence cracked. Eyes widened, hands twitched, shoulders stiffened. Every sign of guilt rose to the surface. Then I played the first recording. Tom froze. His eyes dropped to the ground. The recording captured him describing parts of my property as if he were selling off pieces of a family heirloom that was never his. His voice carried no hesitation, no shame, only a hunger for what he thought he could gain. When the recording ended, he finally looked at me. But the look he gave was not proud or bold. It was the look of a man caught in his own trap with no way to explain the snare around his foot. The others shifted in their seats. Their breaths grew shallow. Their hands fidgeted in their laps. One tried to speak, but his voice shook so badly he stopped midway. Another attempted to accuse me of staging the evidence until I pulled out a signed document he had tried to submit with a forged signature. When he saw his own handwriting beside my real signature, his face drained of color so fast it was like watching a candle go out in one strong gust of wind. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I did not show anger, even though anger had lived inside me for weeks. Instead, I spoke with a calm they did not expect. A calm that only comes when a man knows he holds the truth in one hand and justice in the other. I explained that the law was now aware of every move they had made, that an attorney far beyond their reach had already begun preparing filings, that every forged document, every false claim, and every secret meeting had been recorded, stored, backed up, and delivered to someone who could not be bought. Their silence was so deep it felt like the whole barn had stopped breathing. I told them that I would not sell, that I would not be threatened, that the land they tried to take had survived storms far worse than them. I watched their arrogance fall apart one piece at a time. What replaced it was fear, real fear. the kind that shows in the eyes before it reaches the voice. They looked at each other searching for a way out, but there was none. Not anymore. They had pushed too far, crossed too many lines, and now they were standing before the truth with nowhere to run. Tom tried to speak. His voice cracked like dry wood. He muttered something about misunderstanding, something about being misled, but the evidence on the table answered every excuse before he could finish his sentence. The other men dropped their heads. One wiped sweat from his brow. Another stared at the ground, refusing to look at me. The room grew so tense it felt like the walls themselves were listening. I stood up slowly. I told them that the land was staying in the family, that every acre, every fence line, and every old tree would remain where it belonged. I told them they would no longer set foot on my property without facing consequences they could no longer avoid. I walked them to the door without a single raised voice, without threats.
2 weeks passed after the confrontation in the barn, and during those days the air around the farm felt different in a way that is hard to explain. It felt lighter yet heavier at the same time. Lighter because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Heavier because I knew the last part of this battle would not come from me, but from the forces I had quietly set in motion long before they realized how deep they had sunk. I went through my days with a calm that felt almost unreal. I fed the animals. I walked the land at sunrise and again at dusk. I sat on the porch listening to the wind roll through the fields. It was as if the land itself was waiting with me, holding its breath for the moment everything would shift. Then one morning the moment came. Not for me but for them. It started with a knock at their front door. A simple knock carrying the weight of every lie they had told and every deed they thought would stay buried. I was not there to see it in person, but word travels fast in a small community where nothing stays secret for long. It was the kind of knock that rewrites the balance of power in a single second. The kind of knock that changes a future before the door even opens. The kind that comes when the law has finally caught the scent of truth. I had already sent the documents, not with my name, not with any hint of personal involvement. I packaged every photo, every recording, every forged document, and every written testimony into an envelope and mailed it anonymously to the state authorities who were far beyond the influence of our local officials. I knew the developers trusted their connections too much. I knew they believed they were untouchable. And that confidence was exactly what made them blind to the danger walking straight toward their front door. When the investigators arrived, they did not come quietly. Multiple cars pulled up to their office in the city and to their private homes. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Employees stood outside frozen with confusion. Within minutes, the calm morning turned into a storm of official steps, interviews, and demands. The developers stepped outside thinking it was some minor misunderstanding, but the look on their faces changed quickly once the investigators began reading out the list of violations. Fraud, coercion, forged permits, illegal pressure on landowners. Each accusation landed like a hammer hitting stone. Their offices were searched from top to bottom, paperwork pulled from drawers, computers taken away, files examined under harsh fluorescent lights. Every secret they had tried to bury rose up like something long trapped beneath the ground, finally breaking free. Their bank accounts were frozen, which meant the flow of money they depended on was suddenly cut off like a river dried into cracked soil. Without money, their influence meant nothing. Without influence, their threats lost power. Without power, they were simply men who had gambled too much and lost everything. News travels fast in a rural county, and by noon everyone knew what had happened. People gathered at diners and gas stations whispering in low voices. The same folks who once repeated rumors about me now shared new stories about the developer's downfall. Some were shocked. Some pretended they always knew something was off. Some shook their heads in disbelief at how quickly the mighty had fallen. And in every whispered conversation there was one clear theme. Justice had finally arrived. I did not go into town to hear any of it. I stayed home, sitting on the porch with a warm cup in my hand. I watched the horizon stretch out in front of me. The fields waved gently in the wind like they were breathing freely for the first time in months. There was no need for me to celebrate. No need for loud cheers or triumphant shouts. My victory did not need an audience. It lived quietly inside me in a way that felt grounding and steady. Justice does not always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives soft and sure like the sunrise. No alarms, no grand speeches, just the weight of consequences arriving exactly where they were earned. And that is what happened that day. No violence, no shouting, no revenge fueled by anger, just accountability delivered to the doorstep of the people who believed they would never face it. As I sat there, I felt no gloating, no thrill of payback. Instead, I felt something deeper, a sense of restoration, a sense of balance. The farm had been threatened by greed and dishonesty, but it survived because truth held steady. My grandfather always said wrong has a way of catching up even when it travels in disguise, and watching those men face the reckoning they had built with their own hands proved that wisdom truer than ever. The land around me looked peaceful again. Birds rested on the fence line. The dogs lay at my feet without the restless growls they once carried. I leaned back in my chair and let the afternoon breeze brush across my face. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at ease. The storm had passed. Justice had knocked on the right doors, and the legacy I fought to protect stood stronger than ever. After the storm had passed, and the echoes of the confrontation and the investigations faded, life returned to the farm with a quiet rhythm that felt almost sacred. The first mornings were the hardest. I would wake before the sun, walk across the dew-soaked fields, and notice things I had ignored in the frenzy of the past months. Broken fences left by the intruders, gates that no longer fit perfectly, tools misplaced in corners where they had been tossed in a hurry. The farm bore scars from the battle, subtle reminders that someone had tried to take it from me. But unlike before, I no longer saw damage as a threat. I saw it as a map of lessons, each mark and dent telling me where I had been tested and where I had prevailed. I spent weeks repairing everything that could be repaired. I replaced fence posts with stronger timber, reinforced locks and gates, and cleared pathways where machinery had been parked carelessly. I even planted a few new trees along the edges, small saplings that would one day grow as tall and steady as the oaks my grandfather had planted decades earlier. Each nail I hammered, each branch I tied, each board I replaced felt like a reclamation, not just of land but of pride, history, and family legacy. The farm began to feel whole again slowly under my hands and patience. Legally, I strengthened the boundaries as well. I updated all my documents, double-checked property lines, and made sure every corner of the land was accounted for in the eyes of the law. I hired a new surveyor who was thorough and meticulous, the kind of man whose work left no room for question or doubt. I did not want to leave a single avenue for deception in the future. The legal shields I built were as much a part of my peace of mind as the repaired fences. For the first time in months, I could walk across my land without checking my back, without wondering who was watching, without imagining what schemes might be unfolding in the shadows. Family became a complicated part of the healing. A few relatives had been misled or coerced, acting out of fear or greed, and I approached them with cautious forgiveness. We spoke openly about the events, about the mistakes, about the pressure they had faced. The conversations were not easy. Emotions ran high, tears were shed, voices raised in anger, and yet in the aftermath, a fragile trust began to return. But for those who had shown true betrayal, who had knowingly stood on the wrong side of integrity for personal gain, I kept my distance. I realized some wounds were too deep for reconciliation, and some lessons required separation for the sake of survival. Protecting the farm meant protecting myself and those who deserved to be a part of this legacy. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch as the sun dipped below the hills, casting long golden shadows over the fields. The land, once threatened, now breathed a calm, quiet life around me. Birds nested along the fences, the dogs roamed freely without alert growls, and the wind carried a smell of earth and grass that felt like the most honest reminder of home. Each day, as I tended to the fields and watched the seasons move across the farm, I felt a deep, unshakable pride. I had protected what mattered most. I had not only survived the attempts to steal the land, I had turned the tables in a way that spoke louder than threats or anger ever could. And yet the lesson stayed with me. I understood more clearly than ever that vigilance is a lifelong companion. Greed and deception often hide behind familiar faces, behind smiles and polite conversation. Trust must be measured, and loyalty observed. The farm had taught me that strength comes from patience and strategy, that justice does not always arrive immediately, and that survival is a combination of courage, foresight, and unshakable integrity. Over time, the farm became more than just land. It became a symbol, not of wealth or ownership, but of resilience and endurance, of justice achieved quietly but fully, of a legacy preserved against those who underestimated the value of truth. It stood as a testament to the fact that some things, no matter the pressure or the deceit arrayed against them, are worth protecting with every ounce of one's spirit. As I walked along the fences, tending the cattle, mending the barns, and planting new seeds for the next generation, I felt a satisfaction that was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, steady, and deep. The farm was mine, my family's, and safe. The people who had tried to destroy it had faced the consequences of their actions, and the land had survived. And in that survival, in that careful preservation and patient vigilance, I found a sense of peace I had never known before. The farm, once under threat, had become a sanctuary, a living story of endurance, strategy, and quiet justice. Every corner, every tree, every fence post held a memory of struggle and triumph, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, the right course, chosen patiently and with care, can restore what is precious and teach the ones who would do harm that their actions never go unnoticed. And in that calm, as the sun disappeared behind the hills and the wind carried the scent of soil and growth, I knew that the legacy of my grandfather, the integrity of my family, and the soul of the land would remain intact for generations to come. Sitting here now on the porch, watching the sun spill gold across the fields my grandfather once walked, I find myself thinking about everything that happened: the letters, the lies, the whispers, the betrayals, the long nights spent planning, the confrontation, and finally the quiet reckoning. It's strange how life can stretch a single lesson over so many days, weeks, months, until it seeps into every thought and decision. At first, I thought the fight was only about the land, the fences, the trees, and the barns, but the deeper truth hit me slowly, like dawn breaking over the hills. It was never just about the farm. It was about respect, about honor, about knowing what is yours and standing for it even when the world, or the people you thought were friends, seemed determined to take it away. Betrayal is a strange and heavy thing. It cuts in ways no physical wound ever can. I felt that cut from Tom, my cousin, and from others who once laughed at my table and shared my hardships. I felt it in the quiet glances of neighbors who turned away, in the whispers of people who promised loyalty but acted in secret. It left a bitter taste in my mouth, one that took weeks to swallow and longer to understand. And yet, in that same bitterness, I found clarity. I realized that raw anger, as justified as it may feel, is like fire without control. It burns, it scares, it can destroy, but it rarely achieves what you truly need. Patience, observation, and careful planning are tools far stronger than rage. They allow you to turn a situation, to reveal truth, to expose deception without ever stooping to their level. I also learned that vigilance is a lifelong companion. You cannot assume that familiarity equals safety. Greed and dishonesty often hide behind the faces you know best. Even those you trust can falter or choose paths that seem unthinkable. And so, the lesson is simple but not easy. Protect what you love, not just with your hands, but with your mind, with foresight, with the quiet strength that refuses to yield to fear. Guard your legacy, honor your history, and never forget that standing firm in truth is more powerful than chasing revenge out of anger. The farm, once just soil and fences, became something greater through this struggle. It became a living testament to resilience and justice. It became proof that integrity, patience, and strategy can overcome even the most insidious threats, that the careful hand and the steady mind can outlast greed and deceit. Looking over the fields now, every tree, every corner of the land, every fence post carries not just my grandfather's labor, but also the lessons I learned through betrayal, fear, and the long fight to protect what is sacred. I hope that anyone listening to this story can take something from it, that they understand how crucial it is to fight for what matters, but to fight wisely, that they remember that people we trust can surprise us in ways we never expect, that challenges often arrive wrapped in ordinary moments, and that true victory does not come from shouting the loudest or striking the fastest. It comes from steady resolve, clear sight, and a refusal to let fear dictate your choices. At the end of the day, the battle was more than survival, it was a measure of character. The farm remains standing taller in my heart than ever. The lessons remain, etched into every action I take and every decision I make. Integrity, perseverance, patience, and strategic thinking. These are the tools that build legacies, not just land, not just wealth, not just words. And in sharing this story, I hope others can see that even when the world seems stacked against you, even when betrayal comes from those closest to you, it is possible to protect what you love, restore balance, and emerge not just victorious, but wiser, stronger, and more grounded than ever before. Because life has a way of teaching those lessons, whether we are ready or not, and in the end, it is the steady hand, the patient mind, and the unwavering heart that turns trials into triumphs and challenges into legacies that endure for generations. Now when I walk through the fields at sunset, the world feels different, not because the land has changed, but because I have. The golden light that settles over the crops is softer now, almost gentler, as if the earth itself is finally breathing easy again after months of tension and quiet war. Each step I take across the soil feels heavier with meaning, yet lighter with peace. It's strange how a place you've known your whole life can feel new after a battle, as though survival has given it fresh roots. The fields whisper differently. The wind rustles through the trees with a voice that sounds almost like my grandfather's, steady, calm, full of the kind of wisdom you only earn by living through storms. Every evening, as the sun dips behind the hills and casts long shadows over the land, I'm reminded of all the lessons he tried to teach me when I was too young to understand. Lessons about grit, about honor, about standing tall when people around you bend in the direction of greed and convenience. He used to say that a person's true character isn't tested when life is easy. It's tested when everything you love stands on the edge of being stolen from you. I didn't fully grasp that truth until the day the first letter arrived. I didn't understand the weight of legacy, the burden of protection, or the quiet strength needed to carry both. Now, I understand it with every sunrise and every mile of land I walk. The people who tried to take what was mine, those who forged papers, whispered lies, manipulated family, and tried to turn neighbors against me, they learned their lesson the hard way. They thought power came from money, from connections, from backroom deals and threats spoken behind half-closed doors. But real strength doesn't come from intimidation or influence. Real strength is born from patience, from integrity, from a willingness to endure long nights and longer doubts without breaking. Real strength is choosing to stand even when the ground beneath you feels like it's disappearing grain by grain. And as much as I would like to say their downfall brought satisfaction, it wasn't satisfaction I felt most strongly. It was closure, a heavy exhale after months of holding my breath. Their consequences weren't about me triumphing over them. They were about balance being restored, about truth finally catching up with deception. There is no victory sweeter than justice delivered quietly, cleanly, without you having to throw a single punch or stoop to the level of those who wronged you. But I gained something too, something far more valuable than watching them fall. I learned that revenge, when done right, is not fueled by anger or rage. Those emotions burn fast and leave nothing but ash. True revenge is steady, quiet, thoughtful. It's not about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about reclaiming your life, your dignity, your peace. It's about making sure their actions don't shape your future, your character, or the legacy you'll leave behind. Revenge, in its purest form, is the restoration of what was taken and the reaffirmation of who you are. Walking through these fields now, hearing the leaves rustle, feeling the soil that generations of my family worked with their bare hands, I carry a deeper understanding of survival, of resilience, of what it means to protect something not because it is valuable to the world, but because it is valuable to you. I no longer take the quiet moments for granted. I no longer assume that loyalty comes naturally or that trust is unbreakable. Instead, I know now that the world can shift in an instant, that people can change with the promise of a few dollars, and that danger can hide in plain sight. But I also know this. If your heart is steady, if your mind is clear, if your purpose is rooted in truth rather than anger, then nothing, not betrayal, not greed, not threats whispered in dark corners, can take away what is rightfully yours. Not permanently, not if you stand your ground. So when I stop at the edge of the field and let the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the trees my grandfather planted, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Not fear, not tension, not anger. I feel gratitude. Gratitude that the land is still here. Gratitude that the truth held firm. Gratitude that I learned who is worth keeping close and who needs to stay far away. Gratitude that even in the darkest moments I never broke. And maybe that is the final lesson in all of this, the one worth passing on. No matter who turns against you, no matter what storms rise, no matter how impossible the fight seems, you cannot give up. You cannot let fear dictate your choices or let betrayal steal your spirit. Stand your ground, protect your legacy, guard your dignity. Fight smart, fight patiently, fight with purpose. Because justice has a way of finding those who refuse to surrender, even when the odds stack high and the nights feel endless. That is what this land taught me. That is what my grandfather taught me. And that is what I carry forward with every step I take across these fields. Never give up, never bow, never let anyone take what is sacred. Because justice, real justice, always finds its way home.